In 632 AD, the prophet Muhammad had revealed to him a divine message, which would come to be recorded in what came to be known as the Noble Quran, and Islam was founded. Although many in the Islamic world have long believed that this holy text has remained unchanged since its original composition, there is recent evidence suggesting that this may not be so. In 1972 in Yemen, during the restoration of a mosque, a thick band of parchment was discovered in a gravesite. After careful and extensive cleaning and various treatments, it became clear that this was a Quran dating from perhaps the 7th century, and thus the oldest in existence. Now, not until 1997 were the thousands of sheets fully assembled and photographed, and very few scholars have had access either to the full set or the earlier sets. I should say that this is an extremely sensitive matter, for a core belief within the Islamic world is that the Quran is not a product of history as such, but the revealed Word of God, and as such is not subject to variation of any kind whatever. Now, on this matter, my own ignorance and the very early phase of scholarly work on the Yemen manuscript warrant a modest silence. The Prophet himself taught that each verse in the Quran has 7 meanings, the first being literal, the last its deepest meaning, and that known to none but God. It is clear then that the Quran as a source of inspiration will retain its power even as scholars subject it to interpretation and textual analysis. Fortunately for the history of ideas, the divine message itself has encouraged and for centuries would support a rich and flourishing intellectual life, a veritable mandate to think and reason clearly about important matters. Of course, in our own contemporary world, where there is a great tension between the Islamic part of the world and the West, tensions that are grounded in political, military, and economic considerations, it's very easy to cast Islamic hostility to the West in terms of a radical cultural difference at the level of intellect itself. Nothing could be further from the truth. Islamic faith is at once a culture, an ethics, a mode of philosophical inquiry, and a commitment to what might be called a reflective life. That there are those who would fashion the teachings into instruments of hate and destruction is a painful fact of recent history, making it difficult to evaluate the tradition itself with the respect that it earned over a course of centuries. Indeed, had it not been for the Islamic scholars in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, the West may never have fully reclaimed its own classical, Aristotelian, and Platonic canon. The year 632 locates the prophet in an era widely regarded as a dark age in the West. Now let's pause to consider this practice of naming ages. After all, they rarely have an opportunity to label themselves. The Middle Ages, or the medieval period, was so called essentially by Renaissance scholars who thought that their own natural heritage was derived directly from classical antiquity, and that if it hadn't been for all those horrible middling intervening years between Rome and themselves, why, they would have picked up the baton immediately. There in Florence, in the Palazzo Vecchio, they would have been friends of Virgil, no doubt. So the Renaissance humanists tended to regard everything that divided the world of Virgil from Florence in the 1400s as middling or medieval. Surely the people of that time did not describe themselves as medieval, arising in the morning and complaining what a horrible thing it is to live in these dark ages or in this middle age. So it's really the historian that assigns labels and sometimes libels against the past, and yet does so generally for at least marginally defensible reasons. Now, if we must call ages classical, early Christian, dark, medieval, Renaissance, there is an obligation to explain the sort of work that we want these terms to accomplish. To call an age dark, presumably, is to refer to some other age judged to be less dark, or perhaps some age immediately following it that in some respect or another is brighter or lighter. Now, the reason we're inclined to think of the period 650 to 850 as dark is because we see very little by way of philosophical energy or originality, very little by way of systematic and critical thought produced at the level of texts, through argument and discourse, through the general and large culture of thought so characteristic of the classical world. A culture of thought that will again be characteristic of the medieval period, particularly the part of it we refer to as the scholastic age. But there are reasons for this relative darkness understood in these terms. And one of the main reasons is that Western communities were under frequent and quite successful attack from just about every direction except the Atlantic Ocean. The Mediterranean Sea, which had been that sea on which Western culture moved, Western culture reinforced itself, refined and promulgated itself, now was in fact closed to the West. The major Mediterranean trade routes were very much under the control of the Islamic world. At one point, the very tools of scholarship, for example, papyrus, no longer would make its way into the West. Syria refusing to export such materials to infidels so that they might record their blasphemies. Vandals and Saracens and Gothic tribes, the collapse of Rome, the breakdown of political institutions, all of these conduced to a disordered, fragmented, and to some extent quasi-nomadic form of life in that part of the world we would now identify as Anglo-European. So there were good reasons for scholarship to come to a halt, at least scholarship in the sense of a progressive and progressing body of knowledge, refined through critical inquiry, refined through discourse, debate, the dialectical method, all preserved and developed within a continuing institutional framework. Now, the Eastern world, the world that would become the Islamic world, actually was the beneficiary of much of the scholarship that had been moved by Constantine when the Roman Empire was centered in the East. The Byzantine world did more to preserve and promulgate classical scholarship than at that time the West was able to do. And so, by the time Islam was militarily successful enough to occupy the Byzantine world and build upon Byzantine culture, it found itself having ready access to classical sources long lost to the West. By the 9th and 10th centuries, we find Islamic and Jewish scholars occupying the major centers of Eastern thought, and what are they doing? They're translating and writing commentaries on works by, of all people, Plato. In fact, Al-Farabi wrote a penetrating treatise on Plato's Republic. And it takes a quite revealing turn in Al-Farabi's hands. He's arrested by Plato's notion that until philosophers become kings and kings become philosophers, there will be no justice in the world. The conclusion drawn by Al-Farabi is that pagan thought was limited by its infidelity. It will not be the philosopher who brings about justice, nor will a king as king. What is required is what? A prophet. Alas, the prophet. Very early, the Islamic commitment is to see to it that all political, naturalistic, and scientific writings record respect for and derive their intellectual inspiration from the teachings of the prophet. We might say that there is an Islamic spin being put on every Western achievement made available to the Islamic world. The teaching itself is in the form of a book of several hundred pages, divided into chapters called surahs. It is in the Arabic language, and the nuances of that language encourage many Islamic scholars to believe that no translation of the Quran can recover the meaning of the text fully. There are clear debts to both Old and New Testament, to both Jewish and Christian prophets, but the Quran is the work, or at least the words, of one person, the claims not subject to intertextual corroboration or analysis. It is the authority on all that matters to the faithful, and to reject that authority is to be an infidel. You understand then why, in doing a gloss on some work by Plato, in considering later works of Aristotle, there will be a desperate attempt, an official, required attempt, to render whatever seems to be proper and true in these works conformable to the teachings of the prophet. This is not the way to do philosophy, but it is a way to move the world. Now, on some interpretations, the world is divided in two: those who accept the prophet, and then what may be called a war zone. We are not dealing here with what might be called an academic subject. Do you see? You're either part of the world of believers or you're in a war zone. Now, that much said, and I quickly add that there was still an independent philosophical movement within Islam. Well, in the 10th and 11th centuries, we begin to see philosophy as a core interest of Islamic commentators. And this for the sake of philosophy itself, even if all things are done in the general sense in the name of Allah. It's not that the prophet is ignored or that the Quran is less important. Rather, there is a wider recognition that there are fields of inquiry that can be developed, as it were, holding theology constant. And to this extent, we can say that what the Islamic world possesses in the 10th, 11th, and early 12th centuries are the challenging works of the ancient Greek philosophers, and they're prepared to deal with these works largely in their own terms. These developments occur early in the history of Islam. Actually, the translations of Plato's philosophy into Arabic were the achievement not of Islamic scholars early in the 9th century, but of Arab Christians. In fact, one of the first important Islamic philosophers, Al-Farabi, whose dates are 870 to 950, will reveal the influence of Aristotelianism in claiming the authority of reason to be greater than that of revelation. Al-Farabi is engaged at this time in scholarship that was probably not unlike what one might have found in Aristotle's own Lyceum. It is scholarship for the purpose of gaining useful knowledge. His attempt to reconcile Aristotelian and Platonic thought records a deep respect for the philosophical originality, the philosophical power of the classical world. Avicenna, who is famous to all Aristotle scholars because of the importance of Avicenna's use of Aristotle in his own writing, has as his dates 980 to 1037. It's Avicenna who comes into possession of Aristotle's metaphysics. What a remarkable moment that was in the history of ideas. This must have been eye-opening to someone in the 10th and early 11th centuries. What Avicenna finds then, and he tends to read Aristotle's metaphysics through Christian prisms, well, he doesn't have an uncorrupted version of the metaphysics, which later will be cobbled together by scholars. But what Avicenna now sees is a philosophical justification for the idea of the universe as rationally ordered, for the idea of law, nomos, as the regulative principle at the level of matter, and that which at the same time can be incorporated as a means of understanding life at the level of spirit, at the level of civics, at the level we might call the level of culture itself. What he finds in Aristotle is a means by which to demystify the natural world, a means by which to oppose and resist superstition and magic. Some books matter. Avicenna's commentaries on Aristotle, however problematical, and however corrupt or defective the version he had at hand, puts Arab scholarship and Islamic thought very much at the center of naturalistic and scientific thinking. The Eastern world of Christianity never lost contact with ancient Greek medical traditions. Eastern medicine is in the direct patrimony of the Hippocratic school. Eastern thought is in the direct patrimony of the experimental physiology of Galen and the theories of Galen. Eastern thought in the natural domain is fortified by research involving dissection, the comparative anatomy of animals, anatomical examinations of those who have died of various diseases, the study of organs in traumatized, infected, or sick individuals. It's a naturalistic medicine that accounts, as I said in an earlier lecture, even for what seem to be almost spirituous or possessing ailments in naturalistic terms. And so there will be this naturalistic cast put on the writings of the later Islamic scholars. One might say that the conquest of Islam enrolled the Islamic world in Greek classrooms. And I do want to emphasize that the Islamic achievement at the level of scholarship is largely by way of a recovering and a promulgating of classical thought. Not thought indigenous to the Islamic world, but thought imported from a classical world and classical traditions, no less vital for all of that. Now, the importance of this can't be underestimated, because if we want to take the world of scholastic philosophy as recovering the gems of ancient philosophy and putting the West back on the path toward a progressive, intellectually and scientifically powered course of discovery, the tools are the well-known, well-worked tools of ancient Greek thought, not only in Aristotle and Plato, but in the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Hippocratics, the legal theories, the institutionalization of inquiry, the perfectionism that sustains lifelong education. The Islamic community's part and participation was an important chapter in the recovery of the classical tradition, and truth be told, the only patent contribution to Western progress that would emanate from Islamic sources. Now, what is needed for critical inquiry is not just the lonely scholar who reads a treatise and writes a learned gloss on it. What we have in East and West by the 11th and 12th centuries are two intellectually warring camps, two different conceptions of human nature and its purposes, two different conceptions of truth at the most fundamental religious level, each camp using classical philosophy as a means of validation. Here there arises a wonderfully rich interpretive exercise as to what Aristotle really meant, what Plato really meant, whether something can be known as a result of prophetic insights or by experience or by reason alone, whether something can be counted on as being certainly true, even if it's at the level of psychology or ethics or politics, as opposed to it being merely probable, what it is that was in the divine message heard by the prophet, and can philosophy make it more fully understood? You get this kind of cross-cultural dialectic. This is, by the way, if the world is to engage in battles, this is the kind of conflict that can enrich and improve and refine. The gun, by the way, is not the way of settling an issue. It's a way of stilling the very means by which issues are reasonably settled. Well, at this point, and in both cultures, Islamic and Christian, philosophical positions may become judged as heresies, leading to something graver than denial of tenure, for example. That is to say, once you begin to use philosophy as a way of vindicating, verifying, authenticating what is essentially a religious position, the wrong interpretation may qualify as an offense against the religion. And with this comes the politicizing of knowledge and of the philosophical enterprise itself. It surely should come as no surprise that as the Christian church solidified its own position politically, economically, and socially, it found itself doing battle with heresies left and right. And we should pause to examine why this sort of thing is perhaps inevitable. So a few words on this. How does a religion solidify its position? It solidifies its position by developing an official canon, an official set of teachings that constitute the way things are. And this now becomes the body of knowledge that can be taught to the faithful. And the faithful are understood to be those who are prepared to be obedient to the teaching. There has to be an official version of the text, official enough to declare at least parts of the long debate to be settled. It is by this means that the great institution of any stripe becomes solidified. But once positions are official, and the burdens are imposed on those who are not prepared to accept its validity, the philosophical program stalls. So, as the writers and thinkers in the Christian world begin to take on the challenges that come from the East at the level of religion, and as a result of those challenges work out an ever clearer version of the canon, an intellectually durable, an intellectually teachable version of the canon, debates break out within the Christian community itself. Some of these were suppressed as certain writings were put on a list of heretical works. We also find certain forms of conduct, long ignored by juridically sensible Roman magistrates, now taking on a new color. In a later lecture, I will examine witchcraft and the witch panics. But it turns out now that to have disorders and diseases of a certain kind suggests something mysterious, even sinister. In this medieval world, the world itself is understood merely as a kind of metaphor for an ultimate reality that is eternal, changeless, all that matter isn't. And events in this transitory world take on the property of signs and symbols. And this expresses itself in the extraordinary practices that we denominate chivalry. But illness itself takes on a symbolic character. As noted, things are different in the Christianity of the East and in the Islamic East, are ever more naturalistic. In the West, the medical traditions of the Hippocratics and the medical teachings and writings of Galen are of secondary importance to an essentially rationalistic and religious perspective on the meaning of life and what is symbolized by disorders of a given kind. So the epileptic in the West, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, or one with palsy or in a frenzy, is paying for what must have been some grave sin. After all, the inherent defect in the human race is a result of Adam's fall. So the terrible things that happen as a kind of punishment may reveal themselves in the form of disease and illness. Disease and illness now have a retributive function. Left to their own devices, these intellectual and, as it were, conceptual tendencies may have arrested intellectual development in the West for quite some time. As a counterpoint to this, Islam proved to be a constructive opponent, informed by the classical perspective and disciplined by Quranic teaching. Islam also marshaled formidable arguments against the religious and doctrinal teachings of a church that was still working out the doctrines that would then survive into the present time. So as a result of Islamic scholarly challenges to those very doctrines, the doctrines themselves become ever more carefully, ever more fully worked out. Again, this constructive dialectic. A church that for a time might have been paralyzed by its own certainties, now brought back into the long debate by challenges coming from the East, and back and forth it goes. Now, the long debate is a term that is useful. And what do I mean when I say that as a result of these Islamic influences and engagement with Western thought, the long debate was resumed? Well, the long debate is the debate about knowledge, conduct, and governance. It's the debate that animated the earliest philosophical inquiries into the nature of things. It's the debate we find on every page in the dialogues of Plato. It's what the entire corpus of Aristotle's teaching and research was all about. How do you put something like that to an end? To say that the long debate was resumed is to say that it had been arrested. I think this has to be said. The way you put a debate to an end is to declare either that you've won, or that your opponent is unworthy, or you simply refuse to speak further on the subject because to speak further on the subject is to lend some credibility to what your interlocutor is saying. The greatest threat to the continuation of the long debate is orthodoxy. The debate stopper is the unswervingly orthodox position. Orthodox, orthos, right, doxa, opinion. That is, the right way to see things such that any other way is wrong. Now, combining that feature of early Christianity that was, in a principled way, anti-intellectual, with the ambitious political and institutional ambitions of the Christian Church, all this validated by the life of Christ, by the Bible, by the words of the prophets, the heroism of the martyrs, then at the end of the day, it is faith alone that is all the good Christian needs and nothing more. Yes, faith in pursuit of reason, but at the end of the day, it is not finally by our wits that we get into heaven, but by the grace of God. I say that if you put all of these elements together, a degree of fundamentalist conviction is achieved that is actually hostile to debate. It takes debate, if not as a heresy, then as an insult to the faithful and as an insult to the faith. Now, to the extent that the contemporary mullahs are satisfied that the last word is in on how the Quran should be understood and on the only form of life permitted by it, they are not only at variance with the teaching itself, but guaranteeing the demise of its authority as men and women seek enlightenment the hard way. What great religious teachers require of us is a kind of elastic hermeneutic agility. The teachings are inevitably in the form of similes and metaphors, analogies and parables. One will not find transcendent truths by pointing at things. One comes closer through stories, by way of symbols, by engaging in the dance, the chorus, the drama, and the dialogue. What Islam achieved, wittingly or otherwise, and I don't think I'd want to say that Islam set out to do this, what the challenge of Islam guaranteed was that the long debate would be revived, that there was more than one book to consult and more than one set of prophecies. More than one person enjoyed the direct inspiration of the divine. More than one language is used to express thanks to God, and more than one culture that might ground a spiritual life. I'm quite certain that Islam did not set out to establish this, and I'm quite certain that it was only a Western world already conditioned by the dialectical and philosophical orientation of the classical world that would accept this as a challenge. Now, in this oddly dubbed medieval age, the long debate, in fact, is resumed. The question again, whether the best route to truth is by reason, intuition, faith, naturalistic observation. So too with ethical and moral questions, these now enlarged by the demands of the faith. We again have planted the seeds of controversy, of heresy, indeed skepticism, the inevitable product of authentic and disinterested inquiry. Roman patrician families knew what they were doing when they exiled Greek philosophers during times of civil strife. This was not thuggish know-nothingism, but an understanding that too much philosophy indeed can weaken the faith. Well, we do have our own versions of this, don't we? We all have membership in a community that strives to be politically correct. We know there are certain unuterables, certain modes and gestures and idioms and vernaculars that come from an ugly and remote past, and the less said about it, the better. There are things we don't question too aggressively. By historical standards, the pressures on us are fairly light. We might lose membership in a club or have a difficult time with a dean, but nobody's getting burned for this, at least not yet. The pressures against sustaining the long debate are always very great. And to the extent that there has been a successful institution that has made its way through a vexing world and found itself now securely in place, one way it stays in place is to make sure that its intellectual foundations are not challenged. and that skeptics and heretics do not get a full hearing. Well, again and for the last time, let me say that quite apart from the tenets of Islamic religion, quite apart from the actual contents of the Quran, the scholarly life, the contemplative life that the Quran requires of the faithful is a life entirely compatible with the long debate. And were it not compatible with a critical inquiry that must ultimately lead to confusion and the progress that comes from confusion, the faithful would never get out from under the burdens of self-deception.